Hello and welcome back to the channel. I am attira.kell and this is A Soldier's Opinion, the series where I focus on the military professions of Star Citizen. I typically try to discuss the history of a given military profession, where we are today, and where I hope we are headed in Star Citizen. But before we get going, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would like to get to 500 subs by the end of the year, and only you can help me accomplish that goal. Now, today we are going to discuss tanks. I may be biased, but in real life, armor is the best branch in any army, and I'm not even an armor guy anymore. And by the best, really I mean the most fun. If you're a young person and are interested in the armed services, I cannot recommend armor enough. Now, with my own personal bias exposed and on the table, what exactly is a tank? Before we discuss the history of tanks, I think it is important to establish a definition. Because hopefully, if I explain this well, you will have a better understanding of how we arrived at the modern tank. Each dictionary I could find has a slightly different definition of what a tank is, but the one I liked the most was the Google's, which stated, a heavy armored fighting vehicle carrying guns and moving on a continuous articulated metal track. Now, in reality, none of the definitions I looked at are great, because the concept of what a tank is has changed over time. While historically this is an accurate description of a tank, today armored vehicles are not simply a tank or not a tank. There are several categories of armored vehicles which may look like a tank at first glance, but are 100% not tanks. My personal definition of a tank today might be a heavy armored fighting vehicle carrying a single-shot main gun on a rapidly traversable turret capable of firing all weapons accurately while on the move, moving on a continuous articulated metal track. So, with that general definition in place, let's quickly discuss the anatomy of a tank so that we understand all the critical components. As we go through this, I'll start with the most basic components of a tank and then refine what actually makes an armored vehicle a tank versus another type of armored vehicle. So, at its absolute most baseline core, a tank has two major parts. Those two parts are the hull, often called the chassis, and the turret. I know, I'm really starting overly simply. So let's push further. As all dictionary definitions state, all tanks roll on articulated tracks. The track is driven by the drive sprocket, which can be located at either the front or the rear of the track. The wheels you see the tank ride on are called road wheels, and they are unpowered. The tank simply sits and rolls on these. There are two types of track designs, which ties more broadly into the overall tank suspension. The supported track keeps the track elevated off of the top of the road wheels. This suspension usually relies on torsion bars. The second is the Christie suspension system, wherein the primary visual difference is the track rests on top of the road wheels. However, the actual suspension is more complex than the torsion bar, as you can see from this image. The hull and track are often protected by a track skirt, which can be armored or simply steel plates. These should open so that the crew can do maintenance on the track. As a note, CIG, please do not make this a thing. Hull maintenance would be so boring. Okay, with that said, of course a tank has both an engine, which generates power and torque to move the tank, and a transmission, which ensures the right amount of power is transferred to the sprocket, which in turn moves the track. In some modern tanks, like the Merkava, the engine and transmission are located in the front of the tank, while in others, like the M1 Abrams, it is in the rear. Very often, only the driver of the tank sits in the hull. However, some recent designs are changing this trend, and we will discuss that at the end of our turret discussion. Finally, the front end of a tank where you can stand is called the front slope, and the rear of the tank where you can stand is called the back deck. For the turret, there are plenty more terms to learn. Right up front, you have the gun tube, often called the main gun, and here I'll take a pause and explain why all armored vehicles are not tanks in the modern sense. Modern tanks carry guns usually between 105mm and 125mm in size. The gun tube can usually depress the gun somewhere around -10 degrees and elevate somewhere around +20 degrees. Now, you might think this next vehicle is a tank, but it isn't. This vehicle carries a 25mm autocannon, and that alone takes it out of the tank category. Quite simply, it does not have the single round firepower to fall into the tank category. Now this vehicle, you would say, yeah, why not? This is a tank. But no, this is an M109 Paladin. It sports a main gun of 155mm and has a depression capability of around -30 degrees and a maximum elevation of around plus 75 degrees. That's because that while a tank is designed to shoot targets it can see, an artillery piece is almost always shooting at something it cannot see, up and over the terrain. Additionally, another larger difference is that a tank is designed to fire any or all of its weapon systems while moving at any speed, while an artillery piece must stop to fire its cannon. Now, there are many other differences, but for now let's leave it there and continue on. This larger section on the main gun is called the bore evacuator. It exists to ensure the noxious gases released when you fire the main gun isn't pulled back into the crew compartment when the breech block opens. Next we have the gun mantle, which as you can see is the point where the main gun is actually mounted to the tank. This small tube here is the shield for the coaxial machine gun. All tanks, except our Tonk, have a coaxial machine gun. In the right gunner's hands, this is a precision weapon, and more to the point, this is the primary weapon used on a tank when engaging infantry. Moving back, we have the gunner's periscope, which houses all of the gunner's primary sights. There is almost always an auxiliary sight that is mounted as a part of the gun mantle as well. This is less capable, of course, but in an emergency, well, I've never heard a gunner complain. This is also where the tank's primary rangefinder is, which is critical to accurately putting rounds on target. Of note, in the days of old, these laser rangefinders could immediately blind a person standing in the path of the laser, and so we were always very careful when using them. I say olden days because of course I'm an American, and the American Army has made that transition to a less dangerous laser rangefinder. But not all countries have made that transition, so just beware. Moving on, this raised section here is the commander's hatch, or the cupola. The commander's weapon is almost always a large bore heavy machine gun, such as the 50 caliber machine gun seen here. The cupola is special because it integrates commander's vision blocks for 360 degree vision. Each of these are small periscopes so that the commander can see outside of the tank when the hatches are closed. Finally, most all cupolas integrate the commander's weapon that rotates independently of the rest of the turret. This little raised bucket is the commander's independent thermal sight. Very important to the M1A2's overall capability, this sight is completely independent of the gunner sight. This is important because as the gunner is shooting at one target, the commander is hunting for another. When found, the commander can hit one button and the two sights, and of course the main gun, will align, allowing the gunner to engage the new target, while the commander searches for yet another new target, and on until there are no targets left. This hatch here is a loader's hatch for any tank that has a fourth crewman to load the main gun. Many Western tanks follow this convention, and most Eastern Bloc tanks use autoloaders, which removes the need for this hatch. These little guys right here are smoke grenade launchers. Now, this is a fun little trick for tanks because sometimes you need to create emergency concealment to move safely. Typically, the smoke used during combat operations is white phosphorus smoke, specifically because it builds a cloud very quickly. But these have an added advantage that, because it's white phosphorus, it is also very hot. Now, as I said, in most cases, a tank employs smoke if it is in need to reposition under fire. But if a tank is being surrounded by infantry and is about to be overwhelmed, it can pop these grenades and quite literally have a good chance of burning infantrymen alive. And if they breathe in, well, their lungs basically melt. While this may seem exceptionally brutal and cruel, I'll tell you the first lesson I was ever taught about tanks. Everything on a tank is designed with one purpose in mind: to kill. The tank doesn't care how it kills or who it kills, so be safe in everything you do. Now, we're almost done, so let's hit a couple more items. This little stick on the back is called the crosswind sensor, and this is a critical component to the accuracy of the main gun. It helps the computer with the correct horizontal aim point for the gunner based on the wind at the point of launch. And finally, this section here is called the turret ring. This is the point at which the hull and the turret connect, and is generally thought of as the sweet spot for getting what is called a catastrophic kill of an opposing tank. Because of this, tank designers seek to minimize this space as much as possible, thereby minimizing the sweet spot. And just because I want to have a little more fun, there are other components as well, such as these boxes here called sponson boxes, which are used for tools and other personal item storage, and this little rack here on the back of the turret is called a bustle rack, which is for more personal storage. Alright, cool? I hope you got all of that. Of course, there are more parts and pieces, but I hope that quick review answers most everyone's questions on what things are on the exterior of a tank. So with that complete, let's jump into the history of tanks. Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard of the concept of parallel development or simultaneous invention, but for those who are unaware, this is the concept that two people can have the same idea or create the same invention at the same time, but in different places, independent of each other. Well, it seems medievally speaking, tanks experienced something of a parallel development in the 15th century. Our first inventor comes from Bohemia and lived in 1420. And for those fans out there of Kingdom Come Deliverance, these events were exactly during the time of that game. Jan, Count Ziska, was a noble at the court of Wenceslas IV. When Wenceslas died and Sigismund attempted to seize Bohemia for his own, Jan Count Ziska fought against him. It was here that he developed his version of what might be considered a proto-tank. He mounted cannon on mobile, armored farm wagons. Now, we might simply lump this in with an iteration of medieval artillery, but I think most people have instead assessed that this is one of, if not the first attempt at a tank, especially due to the armored aspect of Ziska's design. Our second inventor is none other than Leonardo da Vinci. In 1487, da Vinci wrote to the Duke of Milan, "I can make armored cars safe and unassailable, which will enter the closed ranks of the enemy with their artillery, and no company of soldier is so great that it will not break through them. And behind these our infantry will be able to follow quite unharmed and without any opposition." Inspired by the shell of a terrapin, turtle, Da Vinci's design was envisioned as a self-propelled armored car ringed with cannon. It's hard to imagine it as anything other than what we would call a tank. But unlike Jan, Count Ziska, Da Vinci never built his concept, though I will point out that Da Vinci did incorporate a key innovation into his vehicle. That innovation was sloped armor. Amongst the myriad of problems engineers have assessed would have arisen in Da Vinci's design, sloped armor was an effective concept that would not be seen again until World War II. Now, let's fast forward a few hundred years. I must note that there was a lot of innovation on tanks that happened in a short period of time, so I have really compressed this to hit some of the high points so that we can move along to Star Citizen. Now, most of the generals of the early 20th century believed that the First World War would unfold much as the Napoleonic Wars did. They did not see the machine gun as the terrible threat that it was. As World War I transitioned from this aspirational idea of maneuvering armies into the realities of trench warfare, both generals and politicians alike began looking for ways to break the stalemate. Interestingly, in 1903, H.G. Wells released a short story called The Land Ironclads. This story introduced the idea of the land battleship into society writ large. Within the story, these massive armored vehicles were able to easily cross the trenches of the defending army and reduce them in short order, winning the war. It then is no surprise that this concept of the battleship on land dominated the early thought process of so many when British engineers unveiled Mother. Mother was the prototype for the Mark I, Britain's first operational tank. Considered a heavy tank, the Mark I weighed in at 31.4 tons, fully loaded for combat. As a side note, it was the shape of the Mark I, resembling a water tank, that inspired the British to codename the Mark I program the Tank Program. Though it sounds like an urban legend, this is indeed the truth. The Mark I was quickly followed by the Mark A Whippet, which sources call both a light or medium tank. But the core idea was a lighter tank that was more maneuverable to complement the Mark I. Most of the credit for the success of this early British tank program goes to Sir William Triton, and his designs would soon be iterated on by the other major powers involved in the war. The French rapidly created the Renault FT light tank, which the Americans purchased en masse for their first armored units before releasing their own M1917, which was heavily based on the Renault. They also iterated on a heavier tank, the Schneider CA-1 and the Saint Charmand tanks. Somewhat ironically, knowing what comes next, the Germans only developed a tank in response to the Allies, and they only fielded one tank, the A-7V Sturmpanzerwagen. But of course, the advancement of the tank did not stop at the end of the war, especially for the Germans, who with the rise of Hitler moved their research and manufacturing capabilities to remote locations in Russia, of all places, to keep their intrigues hidden from the rest of Europe. Whole TV series have been made on the tanks of World War II, and I do not intend to repeat their work here. Suffice it to say that all the great powers of the period were fairly prolific in their development and production of the tank. But, as a quick summary, the most infamous of German engineering was the Tiger I, or the King Tiger. A heavy tank, the Tiger was fielded to fight in North Africa and Russia in 1942. It integrated the amazing 8.8cm KWK 36 gun, which was derived from the famous and flexible 8.8cm flat gun, also known as the German 88. The most famous of American tanks from the period was the medium tank, the M4 Sherman. Reliable and cheap to produce, thousands of Shermans were used throughout World War II. The chassis of this tank would also prove quite flexible as America iterated on the Sherman's design throughout the war and indeed for a short period after. Now, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Soviets' medium tank, the T-34. The T-34 was an absolutely excellent tank. Introduced in 1940, the T-34 would flood the battlefield as the Soviets produced around 80,000 over the course of the war. It was the T-34 that would finally grind Germany's Operation Barbarossa to a halt and reverse it. In the post-war years, the T-34 would be exported around the world and would remain in operation well into the 20th century. Quite a remarkable feat. Let's transition now to discuss the Cold War era. We're not going to discuss all of the tanks of the Cold War because all major great powers iterated many times on their tank designs. However, we will hit the broad strokes because this era is key to understanding how we got to where we are today. So right off the bat, we must understand that the Cold War period, beginning almost immediately after the conclusion of World War II, also marks the beginning of the nuclear age. And at the start of this age, only the United States possessed the bomb. Because of this, for around 4 years, the West, feeling very confident in their nuclear capability, felt that tanks were no longer relevant, and so the US Army began the process of divesting the Army of its tanks. But while America was divesting tanks, the Soviets continued to iterate and produce at a rapid pace, replacing the T-34 with the T-54 and then the improved T-55. They also focused on developing a way for tanks and their crews to survive a nuclear blast. Well, at least along the edge of the blast radius. However, 29 August 1949 would change the West's confidence calculus with regard to non-nuclear war when the Soviets tested their own nuclear weapon. Now, with the scales a little bit more balanced on the nuclear front, the West began again to develop their own new and improved tank designs, resulting in the aforementioned rapid iterations on tank design and capability. And it is here that I will take a pause and talk a little bit about CIG's development of the tank as it relates to the history of the tank. Somewhere along the line in the late 1940s, military doctrine of rapid maneuver of armored forces left the concept of the heavy tank in the dust. Heavy tanks were considered too slow and had too many limiting factors, such as weight, to remain relevant to those modern tactics. That is not to say that they disappeared entirely, as heavy tanks were in service as late as the 1970s, but they were certainly in decline. The final nail in the coffin would be the development and fielding of sophisticated guided anti-tank missiles and development of new, more powerful tank guns, which when mounted on medium tanks allowed heavy tanks to be both outmaneuvered and at least matched in firepower. I will talk about this a little more when we discuss tanks in Star Citizen and what I would like to see. Moving on though, it would be the medium tanks of World War II that would grow and evolve into the main battle tank, abbreviated MBT. Even though of course the modern MBTs of the world drastically outweigh the heavy tanks of days gone by. Now, I thought a lot about how to talk about the tanks of the Cold War. There is just an explosive amount of development that occurred between 1945 and 1989. So, to show the progress of tank development, I'm going to have to choose some exceptional outliers in each class. For light tanks, the Soviet PT-76 stands out because while it was fielding in 1952, in 2002 as a young lieutenant, I remember it still being on the vehicle identification test for gunnery qualification. This was because, as with so much of Soviet equipment, it was exported around the world. Impressively amphibious, this light tank was used primarily in a reconnaissance role and was eventually replaced with the BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle. And honestly, for light tanks, we see that as a trend around the world, infantry fighting vehicles have mostly, if not completely, replaced light tanks in modern advanced armies. For the Americans, the M551 Sheridan is the standout light tank. In service until 1997, the Sheridan was airborne capable and had a main gun that could fire both conventional ammunition and the MGM-51 shillelagh guided missile, which is a unique feature for an American tank. Primarily an armored reconnaissance vehicle, it was never officially replaced in the American inventory. And by this I mean that its airborne capability was never really replaced. As with the Soviet BMP-1, the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle has taken over the role of armored reconnaissance for the most part in the American Army. Now we are going to jump to the heavy tank, and so the family of our very own Nova tank. Following our light tank example of Soviet and America, we'll start with the Soviets. The T-10 heavy tank was Russia's last fielded heavy and was put into service in 1952, with only around 1,400 produced. When compared with the T-72's 50,000 tanks produced, it becomes immediately clear where the priority was placed. Initially, the T-10 had a 12-cylinder diesel engine with around 700 horsepower. Its range was around 150 miles, but to achieve this, it had to maintain a speed of around 18 miles per hour. Its maximum speed, a whopping 26 miles per hour, significantly increased fuel consumption and thus lowered the range. So immediately you can see that this tank was a logistical nightmare and a maneuver warfare failure. But even so, this 52-ton behemoth with its 122mm main gun would stay in service until 1996, which was a little bit of a shock to me. I had no idea heavy tanks were in service that late. In truth though, the T-10 was upgraded to have a much higher top speed, around 50 kilometers per hour, through an improved engine. But the cost of the tank was much higher and the production much slower than that of a medium tank. So, with a high cost to achieve effectiveness and a slow production time, you can see why heavy tanks fell out of modern military use as faster medium tanks with better composite armors, similar firepower, and less maintenance overhead came to the forefront of tank doctrine. The American efforts regarding heavy tanks culminated in the M103. Heavier than the T-10 at 62 tons, it was slower and had less range than its Soviet competitor. This tank sported a 120mm main gun, which was certainly commensurate with the T-10s. However, when fielded, it had a maximum speed of around 21 miles per hour and about an 80-mile range. Now, this was certainly improved over time. Noticeably, the range eventually jumped to around 300 miles with the M103A2. But even more so than the T-10, the M103 just didn't fit the bill for modern maneuver doctrine. I should also point out that only around 300 were ever produced. But let's now fast forward to the modern and talk about the modern medium tank, or today, what we call the main battle tank. In the main battle tank class, there are only two real tanks we need to talk about. Now, I know a lot of British or German tankers will scoff, but within the scope of modern memory, the Soviet T-72 and the American M1 Abrams are the primary contenders of the Cold War. This is not a disparity on the Leopard or the Challenger's quality. just that they were not the quintessential tanks thought of in regard to the Cold War, the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, the T-72 entered production in 1972, and over the course of its production run, it is estimated that around 50,000 have been built. As you can imagine, because tanks are expensive, there have been many variants to avoid the development of an entirely new platform. And so there are around 20 variants of this tank that are still a tank. There are still more variants where the Russians adapted the T-72 hull for things like recovery vehicles and bridge ladders. The early T-72 was armed with a massive 125mm main gun and carried 39 rounds in the vehicle. It sported all the tank innovations of the time: a Soviet version of composite armor, a radiation lining to protect the crew, and an MBC protection system. It also supported an autoloader, a system that the Soviets favored over a human loader. When functioning fully, the autoloader enabled the T-72 to fire 8 rounds a minute, or 1 round every 7-ish seconds. Not too shabby. What it lacked, though, was good night vision capability, which we also suffer from in our very own Nova tank. The most recent outgrowth of the T-72 is the T-90. Now, yes, they are sort of different tanks, but the T-90 clearly takes most, if not all, of its design cues from the T-72, though clearly sporting advanced technologies across the board. Now, as we said, the M1 Abrams was the T-72's primary competitor on the potential battlefields of the Cold War. First entering production in 1978, around-ish 10,000 have been built. Like the T-72, roughly around 20 variants have come along over the course of the M1's lifetime, not counting experiments that never were, and variants like bridge ladders and recovery vehicles. Beginning life with only a 105mm main gun, but carrying 55 rounds, the M1 at first glance seems less capable than the T-72. But those original M1s were much more capable than their gun size would suggest. Though I will say here that the M1 then and now uses a human loader, so rounds per minute are inconsistent as they are defined by how fast the loader can load. The M1 also supported radiation and NBC protection, but it also came with actual a.m.m.o armor, making the M1 a very survivable tank. The M1 also sported an incredible night sight capability, leading US forces to adopt the saying, "We own the night." But there are still 2 more innovations that make the early M1 stand out. First is the roughly 1500 horsepower gas turbine engine that could burn any grade of petrol, diesel, aviation fuel, or kerosene. But the single greatest advantage of the M1 had over the T-72 was its gun stabilization system, which of course linked to the M1's fire control system. This allowed the M1 to have a very high first hit probability while on the move, even at high speeds, a feature almost all Western tanks of the day had. The Russians struggled with this innovation, having to either slow or stop to fire accurately. Today, there is a resurgence of tank designs as the great powers of the world are working to modernize their ground armies. Now, with that said, the current crop of main battle tanks are not likely to be replaced, but instead drastically improved upon. The M1 Abrams has most recently been upgraded to the Abrams M1A2 Set V3 Systems Enhanced package, with a V4 in development. Still equipped with a 120mm smoothbore cannon, 2 7.62mm machine guns, of which one is coaxially mounted, and a new lower profile Crow system with a tried and true M2 50 caliber machine gun mounted, the M1 still packs as much firepower in one tank as an entire infantry company. Weighing in at just around 74 tons, its turbine engine still produces around 1500 horsepower. Its impressive original armor package only continues to improve. a.m.m.o armor has now been improved by integrating denser plating of various materials as well as reactive armor. America continues to make the Abrams more and more difficult to kill. As a side note, a.m.m.o armor, though initially unique in its design, has now come to serve as a common term for all composite tank armors. Originally designed by British and American scientists, its makeup, thankfully, to this day, is still classified. Another key capability we have today that has not been integrated into Star Citizen yet is forward-looking infrared or FLIR night sight capabilities. But beyond the wonderful ability to see in the dark, which of course is very useful, these sights also have a magnification capability. These sights begin at 3 power and increase to 25 power magnification. Currently we cannot zoom in the gunner seat of the Tumbril Nova, so I would love to see this fixed. Beyond this allowing you to fire more accurately, it also greatly increases the tank's ability to recon an area before moving forward. For the Russians, because we've established a trend I refuse to break from now, they have developed the T-14 Armata, a fascinating tank design. The standout feature for me is the completely unmanned turret. If you were to, I don't know, look at this cutaway of the T-14's remote turret, and then look at how the Nova is set up, you kinda have to ask the question, where's the ammunition for the Nova? The T-14 introduces a series of innovative ideas. Its very cool remote unmanned turret houses a 125mm smoothbore gun fed by an automatic loader. The turret carries 45 rounds of ammunition, and the main gun can fire laser-guided missiles, which is a long-time staple of Russian tanks. The T-14 also brings to bear an active protection system, which in theory can defeat incoming tank main gun rounds, and a fancy local jamming capability designed to disrupt incoming anti-tank fire and forget missiles. All in all, the T-14 is a pretty interesting tank. And to top it off, the Russians are working on a mount to enable the T-14 to carry a 152mm gun in the future. Well, no one ever said Russia didn't build them big. Alright, we have talked a lot about the history of tanks, mainly because tanks are fun. But let's now talk about what we know about tanks in Star Citizen. What we have in lore for tanks in general is sparse. As far as I can see, there is only one existing tank in lore, but hey, if I missed something, let me know in the comments spot down below. What I could find is that within lore, Tumbril seems to be the primary tank provider for the UEE. The Nova is said to be reimagined for the modern age, as well as called a classic. I don't think that means that there was a previous version of the Nova, and this is an updated version. I do think this is simple marketing to make us feel like the Nova has some measure of style, which I mean, it does. The Nova was designed during the Second Tavaran War, and it became famous for its performance during the Battle of Corn Pass in 2605. Now, the Second Tavaran War began in 2603, which means that Tumbril designed, built, tested, marketed, and manufactured a tank in 2 years. I cannot begin to tell you how unrealistic that is. But I think we can choose to suspend disbelief, assuming that the UEE just forced the process without any of the traditional government controls to protect taxpayers from the government wasting their precious UEC. Now, we also know that the Tumbril Nova was designed to replace Tumbril's DX-20. Now, from what we know, the DX-20 was a Tumbril civilian utility vehicle that was converted into an Armored Personnel Carrier, or APC, for the First Tavaran War. This, of course, means that the DX-20 is a pre-Messer era armored vehicle, though likely it stuck around for a while during that era, given that it was generally seen as a very reliable vehicle. So in reality, it seems we have very little information on past armor capabilities for Star Citizen. It appears that the United Planets of Earth didn't feel the need to develop ground combat capabilities, or such capabilities are simply overlooked by the lore. In either case, I don't see a problem, though I would love for the lore team to build out 1 or 2 lore dumps on how ground combat was conducted in past eras. I say this because I get the impression that in the same way the US Air Force thinks they can win wars, the UEE Navy also seems to think an opponent can be defeated with only space power. Of course, this is incredibly foolish, as no Air Force or Navy has ever won a war on its own, and in fact, today it could be said that no single branch of service, Army, Navy, or Air Force, could win any war on its own. It requires what we call the joint fight, all these capabilities fighting in concert to defeat the enemy. This doesn't look like it will change for a long time either, so it would be fun to see some lore on the ground formations, beyond infantry, that have existed throughout the centuries from the lore team. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk quickly about what I would like to see from CIG regarding tanks. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on the Nova tank, and I will link up that walkthrough video here. So I'm not going to talk about all the things I would like them to tweak on that tank. But as you can imagine, I think there is room to grow the ground vehicle fleet. Not just with tanks, but all manner of vehicles, but for now let's just focus on tanks. First and foremost, I think that every major race should have some sort of armored vehicle. Humans, Vandal, and Xi'an should certainly have tanks, where I think the Banu might have something more akin to an M2 Bradley as their main ground vehicle. If I were to be specific with regard to how I think CIG should add to the structure of their tank lineup, I would say that humans continue to field their heavy tank, the Vandal and the Xi'an should field a 2-person main battle tank, and both should operate off Gravlev technology, and maybe drive like the tanks from Activision's 1998 Battlezone if you felt like it. If humanity developed an MBT, it should still remain a tracked vehicle. The Banu and the Xi'an might also field light tanks with some type of unique tech. For instance, a Xi'an light tank might be droppable from a very, very high altitude, much like the Sheridan. For the Banu, I don't know. Leave in the comments what you think a Banu light tank might have as a unique capability. So, in total, we might have 1 heavy tank, 3 main battle tanks, and 2 light tanks for players to choose from. A pretty good list of options that could increase the total number of manufacturers in game and further deepen ground combat gameplay. I would also like to say that this is where balance would become important. We would need to slow down the Nova because currently it is way too fast, and that would allow lighter tanks a maneuverability advantage. But maybe those MBTs or light tanks have the same main gun as a Nova, but not the rechargeable missiles, which means they eventually might have to fall back for logistical resupply, whereas the Nova has more staying power. These are the types of balance issues we would need to consider, and CIG needs to consider if they're going to add new tanks. Alright, now that we have talked about the one tool we have available for pure fleet armored combat, the Tumbril Nova, and what I'd like to see CIG develop next, let's talk about how we should both organize and fight our tanks. Now, I know a lot of you out there who tank interest in these videos are either former military or very much enjoy military history, or at a minimum, military focused gaming. So a lot of this will come second nature to you, but for those less familiar, let's start with the absolute base unit for armored combat and work our way up. So, in the West, the base tank unit is a section. A section is 2 tanks, the section leader, and the wingman. 2 sections create a platoon. A platoon is led by a platoon leader, usually a junior officer of the lieutenant variety, and a senior sergeant, typically a sergeant first class or a similar rank. Typically in the American military, the platoon leader manages both the platoon and his section, and the platoon sergeant manages that second section. And yes, I can hear all the jokes about LTs now. Put them all in the comments. I love them. And yes, some of these jokes are grounded in truth, and others in ignorance. This structure is how we grow good officers. We pair them with good senior non-commissioned officers or senior NCOs to learn. Now, obviously in gaming terms, we don't really need this level of structure, but what we do need is clearly defined roles so everyone understands what they are supposed to be doing. Okay, moving on. Typically, 3 platoons makes up a company, and you guessed it, 3 companies typically makes up a battalion. Now, I'll stop there since that is already way more than the game can handle right now. There are plenty of online resources to learn more about how a unit that large is structured, and gamers are pretty good at organizing structures anyway. Now, I have described the Western model of the 4-tank platoon. but there is what I might define as an Eastern model as well. That model typically runs 3 tanks per platoon, with the platoon leader and 2 wingmen. So if you're going to try and run ground missions at scale, the first thing you need to do is decide how many tanks you want in a platoon. Normally, I would argue for the 4-tank model. However, there is one compelling factor for Star Citizen that makes the 3-tank model interesting, and that is that a Crusader Hercules can apparently carry 3 tanks at once. 1 platoon per C2 for drop and recovery has a very nice symmetry to it. Now that you were thinking about how to organize at the lowest and most likely level, let's talk briefly about movement formations. Tank combat, like ship combat, is platform based. If you recall in our second video on capital ships, we focused on how to organize the crew as well as showed some of the 2-dimensional formations current navies use. These of course need to be adapted to a 3-dimensional environment, but the concepts are there. Tank formations, on the other hand, require no such adaptation, as ground combat is basically the same as it would be today, with perhaps some new weapon systems, but less variety. And that's not a knock on CIG. While I would like to see them create a representative system for each of the military professions, to create a similar level of selection would be unrealistic. So very quickly, let's bang through the tank formations. Perhaps our most common formation is the wedge. Just as with the dismounted infantry combat, the wedge formation maximizes clear firing arcs to the front and provides only slightly limited firing arcs to the side. This is most often used when in large open areas, allowing tanks significant freedom of maneuver as long as they maintain the formation. Our next formation is the line formation. This is typically used when contact is made with the enemy or in a defensive position. It places all emphasis on forward-facing firepower at the expense of firing arcs to the side of the vehicles. The echelon is our next formation and is an interesting one. There are of course 2 variants, echelon left and right, but there are also a couple of ways to use this formation. For larger organizations with multiple subunits, it is often used to aid in creating a larger wedge. So imagine a company element of 9 to 12 tanks divided into 3 platoons. First platoon may be in a wedge formation at the lead of the company. Second and third platoons may be placed in echelon left and right to further expand the wedge into a company wedge instead of a platoon wedge. Another use of this formation in a tactical sense is to force an opponent to turn their position. By placing increased pressure on one flank of the enemy, the intent here is typically to force the enemy to displace, allowing your forces to advance. As this continues, you place increasing pressure along the enemy line, generating 2 effects. First, if executed with patience and timing, you can slowly turn the enemy formation, hopefully into a more favorable position, while also attriting them. Second, if your opponent is not careful, the enemy can get bunched up as their flank collapses, which will limit their maneuver space to respond to your attack. Alright, our next formation is the column. This is more or less a naturally occurring formation when the terrain becomes constricted, so think of cities and valleys. Both of these push vehicles into a column formation. Roads, of course, also do this even if you are not in constricting terrain. This formation loses almost all of its forward-facing fire arcs in favor of side-facing firing arcs. The column is also commonly used when speed is required, as this is the easiest formation to maintain high speeds in. Our next formation is the staggered column. This formation can be used in similar situations as the column if you are afforded a little bit more room. It is just as fast as a column, more or less, but also allows additional disbursement of the tanks. I would argue that in almost all cases where there is room, this formation is preferred over the column. The diamond formation is our next formation. I would argue that while moving, this is perhaps one of the least used formations, but while stationary, it is ubiquitous. While moving, this formation offers many of the same benefits as the wedge. The main benefit is that when conducting action drills, you are already established in your formation, the diamond formation. But we'll talk a little bit about action drills here in a minute. This formation does offer some unique flexibility for the small platoon if operating in an environment where they are surrounded. With regard to being stationary, the diamond formation is effectively the establishment of 360-degree security for the platoon, all tanks facing out, ensuring that no one sneaks up on you. Our final formation is the inverted wedge, or the V formation. Most often seen at the company level and above, this might also be called the 2 up 1 back formation, wherein 2 platoons are placed in the front of the company headquarters and 1 platoon is placed behind. This provides some good tactical flexibility for the company commander, as once the first 2 platoons come into contact with opposition, he can evaluate the situation and, if needed, push the 3rd platoon into a flanking action. This formation is also used on a larger scale when you want to envelop a target, effectively pushing the 2 leading flanks around the left and right of the objective while the center attacks the objective directly. Okay, we're coming towards the end. I'm now going to talk to you about some core tactics. These are based on real-world tactics, which many of you will say are meaningless because this is a game. But hear me out. With Death of a Spaceman becoming more and more of a reality, I think that putting real thought and planning into your operations will keep you alive longer. Now, throughout the movement formation discussion, we dropped in a couple of tactics for using specific formations, but very briefly, let's talk about some generic baseline core tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, that will help you survive a little longer in your Nova Tonk. Now, this is not all-encompassing. There is so much to ground tactics, and there isn't time to talk about all of it, but I will offer you some starting points to think about. First, make use of the terrain to mask or hide your position. I know this seems simple and obvious, but it's a core TTP that tankers and any military person is thinking about when maneuvering. As you are moving across the ground, look for larger rocks or terrain that you can use for cover and concealment. Stay off of what we call intervisibility lines, or IV lines. These are subtle variations in terrain that you can use to hide behind. The highest point in that terrain is called the IV line. If you are on top of that line, everyone can see you. If you are below it, you are hidden. Basically, try to move in lower ground on the approach to a target until you are ready to expose your vehicle. When you do elect to expose your vehicle, try to expose as little as possible. Usually, a tanker will only pull forward enough to allow the gun to see the target, which means only the turret is exposed to fire. Okay, that is enough use of the word expose. Second, stay at range. Tanks are ranged weapons platforms. Closing into close quarters combat never plays well to a tank's strengths. We don't know what the Nova's sweet spot range will be yet, but it isn't going to be 10 meters. I would expect most tank battles to occur between 700 meters and 1,000 meters, if CIG gives us zoom and night sight capabilities. Third, use the formations and remember dispersion. This means stay spread out. At the bare minimum, if you are spread out and in a good formation, when you do come into contact with the enemy, they won't be able to hit you all at once. This is especially important with the advent of bombing in the verse. One A2 could wipe out a whole platoon if you're bunched up. Fourth, practice what is called contact drills. These drills help you quickly execute actions on contact, but they require everybody to know what is expected of them. The core of this is the action drill. As a platoon leader in a wedge formation, if I say contact tank action left, every single member of that unit knows exactly what we are fighting and exactly what to do. In a well-trained unit, everyone knows what to do from that single sentence. Okay, fifth and final. Try to find a possible path to flank the enemy. That basically means get to one side or the other side of the enemy. This forces them to split their attention and firepower in two directions, while all of your firepower remains massed on them. Most commonly, you should try to flank in the direction that has the most cover and concealment so that the enemy cannot see what you're doing. But if that is not possible, then have one or two tanks lay down suppressive fire to put pressure on the enemy. You can then push the enemy's flank while they are focused on the tanks shooting at them. Well, alright, ladies and gents. I am an old, salty tanker, so I grew up using the FM-1715 Tank Platoon manual. Hell, these were hard to find to come by in my day, so finding a hard copy now will likely be a challenge. Luckily, someone was kind enough to upload a digital copy, and I've put that link in the description below. For Star Citizen, I honestly think all of this will be important. Why? Because CIG envisions a game where logistics is a thing, where death has meaning, and you are going to want to avoid it if possible. So, approaching ground combat with a framework everyone can understand should really improve your odds of survival. And that is it. I love tanks, and I love making this video. I do apologize that it took me so long to get this ASO video out. Work has been quite busy, and I recently took over a new role that has me working some long hours. But I absolutely want to keep making these, both to help you, the player, think about how to approach the military professions in Star Citizen, but also to help CIG conceptualize where they might take these professions through equipment they provide us. So with that, please leave a comment down below on what you agree with, disagree with, or what you think I missed. Do you want to see a GN hover tank? I know I do. Don't forget to like and sub if you want to see more. Come check out a.m.m.o for a small community to play Star Citizen with, and I'll see you in the next one. Later!